Tucker once said, "The best way to predict the future is to create it." Amon and I couldn't agree more. For this reason, we are proud to affirm that the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture is desirable. I'd first like to start this debate by clarifying our definitions. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, desirable refers to qualities or characteristics that are considered valuable, attractive, or beneficial in a particular context or situation. We do not need to prove that it is best, but that it is a good one in a certain situation, as said in the definition, which in this context is to feed people. If we prove this, then it's a good one. So this brings us to our two contentions. One, we need food, and two, we need to protect the environment. One, our first contention, food, is broken down by A, population rising, B, increased food, and C, climate change is destroying food production. A, population rising. As the global population continues to grow at an unprecedented rate, the urgency of finding sustainable ways to feed ourselves becomes increasingly critical. With more mouths to feed and limited resources, the challenge of ensuring adequate food supplies for everyone is daunting. The current crises of hunger and malnutrition will only further be exacerbated if we don't take action now. Around 85% of the world's fisheries are either being fished at full capacity or already overexploited and depleted. As the world's population is expected to reach 9.7 billion by 2050, global fisheries will only continue to be under pressure in order to meet this future demand for seafood. We must produce 30 million metric tons of seafood to keep up with human population growth and increasing consumption of seafood, and the open ocean appears to be the best, if not the only environment that would allow for this expansion, says Aaron Welch. This quote allows us to flow into our point of B, increased food. Increased seafood production. Open ocean aquaculture can help meet the growing demand for seafood by increasing the amount of fish and other marine organisms that can be sustainably produced. This helps provide a reliable source of protein for a growing population and for communities that may not have access to traditional fishing grounds, such as in the Pacific, where fishing is a key source of protein and livelihoods. The hunger crisis is one of the most pressing issues facing humanity today. With the world's population continuing to grow, traditional land-based methods of food production are struggling to keep up with the demand. In 2017, Rebecca Gentry said, "We calculate that if only the most productive areas of the ocean were developed for fish aquaculture, the amount of seafood that is currently captured by all wild fisheries could be grown using less than 0.015% of the ocean surface area. Imagine what we could do with even 5% of the ocean." Open ocean aquaculture offers food security and unmatched scalability to combat the harrowing reality that people are malnourished and that people are starving. C, climate change is destroying food production. Acceleration is imperative because of climate change. Climate change is having a profound impact on the way we produce and consume food. Rising temperatures, changing the precipitation patterns, and extreme weather events are all affecting agricultural productivity, making it harder to grow crops in many parts of the world. As a result, food prices are rising and food shortages are becoming more common. We must accelerate an aquatic method of sustainability for our survival before it's too late. And the ocean uniquely offers a sustainable method. How? Let's take a look at our second contention. 2, climate and environment. Broken down by A, sustainability of offshore placement, and B, adaptation through carbon sequestration. A, sustainability of offshore placement. According to a study by the Food and Agriculture Organization, open ocean aquaculture uniquely located far from shore benefits the environment by preventing eutrophication caused by nutrient and waste buildup. The strong currents and deep waters only found in the open ocean are able to prevent the harms of eutrophication, such as hypoxia, low oxygen level, dead zones, and depleted ecosystems. The improved water quality of offshore aquaculture can also minimize the spread of diseases to wild fish populations, thus also reducing the use of antibiotics and other chemicals that are detrimental to the environment. MPA, marine protected areas, are crucial for protecting marine biodiversity and sustaining fisheries. Offshore aquaculture can uniquely further improve MPAs by reducing fishing pressure on wild fish stocks, enhancing biodiversity by creating artificial reefs, and providing economic benefits to local communities. B, adaptation to carbon sequestration. Marine organisms such as seaweed, shellfish, and more absorb and store carbon as they grow, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This is called carbon sequestration. Open ocean aquaculture can promote the growth of these organisms, leading to more carbon sequestration. This process can be enhanced by using microalgae or seaweed as a feed source and creating artificial reefs made of alkaline materials such as crushed limestone to neutralize the acidity of the surrounding water, ocean acidification. Open ocean aquaculture can also help enhance and protect blue carbon ecosystems, such as seagrass meadows and mangrove forests, leading to more carbon storage. For example, seaweed farming in Norway has increased carbon sequestration and providing an alternate source of income for coastal communities. According to McCready in 2019, expanding breeding space, promoting multi-level artificial upwelling products can improve the capacity of carbon sequestration and exchange by open ocean aquaculture. Oceanographer Dr. Silver Earle said, "The ocean is the largest carbon sink on the planet, the lungs of the earth and the heart of the climate system." So, how can we ignore the heart of the problem? For these reasons and more, Iman and I are proud to affirm that the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture is desirable. Thank you. And I'm open for concepts whenever.
Sure. Okay. So I would.
Are you saying?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
I did not look over.
Don't worry, it's fine. Don't worry.
Good. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So I would like to start. Go out to those aquacultures, provide food, clean them, et cetera, et cetera. How do you solve for the pollution that results of that transportation to those deep water environments? So I'm thinking about the boats to get to your aquaculture and take care of it, the pollution related to those boats. How do you solve for that?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, we do address like pollution concerns and global warming concerns. Clearly, we don't 100% solve for everything, but don't make the perfect the enemy of the good.
Sure. So what kinds of fish do you grow in the open water aquacultures that the affirmative is talking about?
All kinds. My favorite are oysters. I'm a really big oyster fan. So
sure. So what kinds of food do things like oysters and say finfish that survive in these aquacultures particularly well in the open ocean eat?
Some of them can eat like seaweed.
Okay, so that's fine. I want to talk about the question of MPAs. What is the direct relationship between fish farming and the creation of more MPAs?
So MPAs are the marine protected areas. Right?
Sure.
So right now, there's areas surrounding it that are being ruined due to like the pollution, due to disease, right? And these harms are being seeped into MPAs and ruining them. And once we adopt the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture, excuse me, shut the tongue twister. Once we adopt the acceleration of it, it can reduce these harms, thus protecting MPAs. Because they're supposed to be protected areas, but unfortunately, they still need protection. They're very, very sensitive.
Sure. So, on the question of food production,
yes.
How does the affirmative imagine that the fish produced in these aquacultures arrive in communities that need them most?
What do you mean? What do you mean by the arrival?
So, I'll show our hand a little bit. We're going to read evidence that says that the fish that is primarily produced in aquacultures is finfish, or fish that is so expensive that the rich can mostly purchase it instead of.
Then we'd be arguing like just the basic logic of it, right? The more that there is of something, the less it'll cost, and thus the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture is desirable because then the cost will reduce. And when you're talking about the arrival, I'm not really sure what you mean by that. But when it's more accessible, more people can get it. It'll be everywhere, right? So it'll be
what
available
types of regulations?
in developing countries.
What types of regulations are you anticipating would arrive for aquaculture as a result of the plan?
Regulations in what sense?
What ensures that aquacultures are created sustainably and healthily for the environment? Because there are multiple ways to do them. Okay.
Well,
We're just going to get set up. Coloring pens.
Okay.
1 second, TC.
Yeah. Is anyone not good? Cool.
1 second.
The question of this debate is whether or not it would be beneficial to do more open ocean aquacultures. This debate should not revolve around ideal worlds of aquaculture, but instead the hard, cold reality of what it would mean to have a large number of profit-driven businesses running a ramshot through the ocean with very little realistic oversight. The resolution did not name an actor, which means they must defend the entirety of the world engaging in a largely unregulated aquaculture. Any notion that offshore farms will be responsible or well regulated is a complete farce. Ashifa Kassam of The Guardian stated in July, fuel consumptions by boats heading to and from farms could compromise environmental claims. The evidence in support of offshore fish farms remains scant, says Jim Walsh, Policy Director of Food and Water Watch. The development of these fish farms is far from steady to an extent that could make us feel confident. The remote locations would make it impossible to effectively regulate factory fish farming in a sustainable way in our oceans. To think that we will all of a sudden have a regulatory regime that's going to step in and monitor these factories fish farms is ridiculous. A better option may be land-based tanks where fish are farmed in isolation from their surrounding ecosystem. This profit-driven environment in the ocean produces several problems. First is high-cost finfish. Open ocean aquaculture just results in high-cost products that don't feed the world. They cause investments into an industry that never helps those who need food the most, that Ben Belton and 5 other PhDs in food science stated. Most high market value finfish with the potential for use in marine aquaculture are carnivorous. Their production requires feeds containing marine ingredients or substitutes such as microalgae derivatives that are under development and are currently expensive. As a result, the cost of production of most marine fish is high relative to their herbivorous, omnivorous freshwater fish. Offshore high fixed and operating costs prevent participation by all but large investors. We believe that even allowing for improvements in technical efficiency and scale economies, most species promoted as candidates for marine fish farming will not become accessible to low-income consumers. Salmon, the main finfish presently farmed in marine ecosystems and marine environments, provides a relevant example. Salmon farming has been subject to half a century of intensive R&D, great leaps in production efficiency, massive levels of industrial consolidation, and consistently declining real farm gate prices. Yet, high production cost means that salmon remains a relative luxury, inaccessible to anyone outside of the global middle class. Who does the act is a question of desirability, which means that there is, no matter what the affirmative says, there is a trade-off in investments that occur, because corporations are normal means of the affirmative. They said multiple impacts. First, escape fish create multiple problems and algae blooms, Rebecca Loomis, attorney for the National Resources Defense Council, notes in 2020. Finfish aquaculture species has not been thoroughly researched in the open ocean. Very few aquacultures have operated more than 4 miles from shore. Scientists have concerns about the environmental impacts. Rough water conditions and high-intensity storms are likely to damage pens, allowing fish to escape. Escape fish can cause harm for wild fish by outcompeting them and spreading disease and polluting wild gene pools. Fish waste pollutes the water and may aggravate harmful algae blooms, which hurt coastal and fishing communities. Feeding these fish that are at the top of the food chains results in greater overfishing, Ben Belton and 5 other PhDs notes in 2020. Significant growth of marine finfish aquaculture entail increase in demand for marine feed ingredient. Demand for marine feed ingredients has already altered marine ecosystems and has the potential to cause unsustainable levels of exploitation of fish stock, compromise the food and nutritional security of nutritionally vulnerable populations. Second problem, antibiotic-resistant diseases. The heavy overuse of antibiotics in open ocean fish stocks cause disease. Yvonne Lorenzo and Menzo and 5 other scientists published their work in a peer-reviewed journal in 2021 and says fish diseases are a constant threat and the use of antibiotics is a source of concern. Excessive amounts of antibiotics continue to be used in Chilean aquacultures, playing an important role in the emerging public health crisis of antimicrobial resistance. ABR bacteria are spreading in the environment and can become a source of resistant bacteria that can be transmitted to humans. Antibiotic resistance is a top threat in the public health and priority access across the globe. In the U.S. alone, it causes 23,000 deaths per year. Worldwide antibiotic resistance threatens our progress in healthcare, food production, and ultimately life expectancy. And third is that extra transportation from the boats create numerous environmental damages, and cross-examination proves that they have zero regulatory efficiency To stop any of this, Ben Belton and 5 other PhDs in food science say in 2020 that sitting fish cages offshore may attenuate to some of the worst effects of point source pollution. Life cycle assessment indicates that fuel consumed by boats providing transport to and from offshore fish farms can contribute to a large share of overall environmental impacts, concentrated particularly in the impact category of cumulative energy demand and acidification, ozone layer depletion, photochemical oxidation, and global warming. Each of these decimate the ocean, which sustains all life on Earth, the World Economic Forum notes in 2016. Without healthy oceans, our life on Earth would be severely challenged and perhaps impossible. The oceans are the life support systems of all living beings. The Earth can thrive without land, but it cannot exist without the ocean. And terrestrial aquaculture is a far better alternative, Ben Belton and 5 other PhDs noted in 2020, that terrestrial aquaculture is widely available and accessible to low and middle income consumers in countries that account for the majority of the world's aquaculture production, and makes important contributions to food and nutrition security. Finfish in offshore environments cannot compete with cheap herbivorous and omnivorous freshwater fish. Carp, catfish, tilapia, milkfish, and mullets contribute significantly to food and nutrition security in countries including Egypt, Indonesia, and Philippines. The evidence suggests that freshwater aquaculture has far greater potential to contribute to supply the most of the world's farmed aquatic food and contribute to human equity and food security than marine finfish farming. I'm good for cross-examination.
Okay, awesome.
Let me just set a timer, sorry.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
All right, and I'm starting time now. Good. So why does open offshore aquaculture have to be inherently capitalist?
When did I say it had to be inherently capitalist?
Why does it have to be big companies, corporations?
Oh, okay, so you're talking about like everything I said about desirability. So like if you're saying that all of the governments would all of a sudden support aquaculture, that is not normal means. The resolution said, obviously, corporations are the ones that create aquacultures in the first place because aquaculture is industries. So these industries have to create the aquacultures in the first place. That's just like fact. Unless you're saying governments all of a sudden create an industry that, for them, that doesn't exist. That's normal means.
Okay. Your case is that it might be difficult because there are regulation struggles. Why does that mean that the entire concept of it is undesirable?
I said that there were regulation struggles. Is that what you're saying? Sorry, I didn't hear your question.
Yes, was not a majority of your speech about regulation.
No, I just actually couldn't hear you.
Process.
I couldn't hear you. Could you
Oh,
just...
regulations. Do regulation struggles make the entire concept undesirable?
Well, we've heard multiple reasons about why the affirmative is not desirable. First was that it creates high costs, which means that literally you cannot feed the people that you're coming to feed. Second, it creates environmental harm, which we listed a bunch of reasons why. Third was disease, so you cannot say that these fish don't escape because they inevitably do. It's seen in other forms of aquaculture.
Okay, but do the regulation struggles that most of your speech is about and cross-examination, does that solely make it undesirable?
I think any of the reasons we listed can be a reason to reject the affirmative.
Okay, thank you. So you said yourself that open ocean aquaculture farms are about 4 miles outside of the coastal region, right? How
No,
would there be?
I said that now that there is research only within aquacultures that are within 4 miles.
Okay, so
Sure.
yes. Why would there be regulation struggles if it's only 4 miles out?
No, we're saying that there's only science about aquacultures within that. You don't keep aquacultures now, you accelerate them. That is what the resolution says, and that is what you do because you said that. So that means you will inevitably expand beyond those 4 miles.
Okay, and then when we expand, it would be giving more accessibility to more people, right? Because we're expanding.
It will give what to more people?
Accessibility to more people, right? Because you're saying we're limited, right? But if we're expanding.
No, I'm saying that there's no research on anything beyond 4 miles, which is bad because it proves that it's not scientific.
Just linking it to your past argument of saying that we are inaccessible to people, right? To communities. But
They're
don't you
inaccessible
agree-
because of high
do you
costs.
agree? Do you agree with the general idea? Just speaking about anything. The more of there is of something, the less in value it is.
The more that there isn't something, the less bad. Are you just
Yes.
saying high supply, low cost?
Yes.
We're saying that because of the fish that you create. So right now, in open ocean aquaculture,
Yes,
that
I
we
know
farm
what the
are
fish that
highly
you
costly.
create.
Even if there are more of them, it doesn't matter because you require those industries to charge more. Obviously, these industries want to make money. You have
Okay,
zero
great.
evidence in the
Thank you
money
so
to
much.
that
I'm sorry,
stuff.
this is my context time.
Okay,
So
go ahead.
you use the example of finfish, right?
Sure.
Does open ocean aquaculture not use other fish? Does it not grow other fish? Does it not grow algae? Does it not grow seaweed?
I am very confused as to why that's relevant, but we have said that
Because
you
it
do
reaps
finfish
benefits,
in the
that's
first
why.
place, which is important, which is bad. The fact that finfish are used are bad because like everything
Do
costs.
you think that starvation is a global crisis right now?
Do I think starvation is bad? Obviously, I think starvation is bad, but you don't solve it in the first place, so that's irrelevant.
Okay, do you at all provide an alternative? Because we apply.
Yes, we have provided an alternative. I literally said land-based aquaculture like multiple times are a far better alternative to
You don't
solving.
think that land-based aquaculture right now is reaping any benefits that like?
We think expanding land-based aquaculture can solve, which is what the counter-advocacy does.
And is climate change not drying up land-based?
We think that we are better to solve any aspect of climate change because you create pollution and a ton of effects on the environment that are net worse. We're saying that land-based is a better way to solve that because we have net benefits specific to open ocean aquaculture.
Thank you.
It's kind of funny that it's such a big camera stand and then like a tiny.
Yeah, I know, right? It's actually so
Like
small.
I didn't realize the camera was on it at first. I
Yeah,
was
me
like, oh,
too.
they have a stand. That's so cute.
I thought that too. I was like, where's the camera?
Ready?
Yeah.
It is the worst of times, but it is the best of times because we still have a chance. Getting people food is the most important issue in this debate. We know that the population is rising and there are questions about how sustainable the food supply is. But accelerating open ocean aquaculture is beneficial because people are going hungry now. Overfishing will deplete seafood supplies and climate change will limit current food options unless we do something. Everyone needs to eat and increased supplies affect everyone's access and decrease food prices. Thus, it is try or die for open ocean aquaculture. First, looking at food. The malnutrition crisis is a global challenge affecting millions of people, particularly in developing countries. Lack of access to nutritious foods is a major contribution to malnutrition, which can lead to stunted growth and more. According to the UN, it is estimated that 768 million people worldwide are suffering from malnutrition, arguing that it is a significant global challenge that requires significant and urgent attention from everyone. Open ocean aquaculture can resolve this. Leah explained how the production of more things brings the price down and brings more access. So what can it actually do when they get these foods? It produces better food through omega-3 and increased protein. The nature of open ocean aquaculture means that fish farming, there is better quality because being located in the ocean, the water is cleaner and less prone to contamination from pollutants and more, leading to healthier and more robust fish. Second, they have a natural diet, so fish in these systems have access to more varied and natural diets, improving the nutritional value and flavor. For example, open ocean aquacultures use feed mainly locally sourced and sustainable ingredients such as seaweed, which we can farm ourselves and become self-sufficient, which can improve omega-3 content and flavor of the fish. And next, there is more space. Fish in open ocean aquaculture have more space to swim and more, which can reduce their stress and improve the nutritional content. The Blue Food Report by the Stockholm Resilience Center states, some 166 million micronutrition deficiencies can be averted by 2030 if the global production of marine foods is increased by 15.5 million tons, which is 8%, something that is incredibly doable by the ocean. So it has the potential to provide a sustainable source of protein-rich food to communities that lack access to traditional protein sources. The use of open ocean aquaculture can help reduce the impact of traditional farming practices on the environment, and we can address both the immediate and long-term challenges of hunger and malnutrition. In front of us, we have a solution that has the capacity to resolve our problems on a massive scale, and acceleration is desirable because of this. We're told that it's not going to be employable in developing countries because they get priced out. They're already getting priced out in the status quo. We are seeing hunger disparities, malnutrition struggles, and more. At least when we mass accelerate open ocean aquaculture, at least they have a chance. I offer the example of Bangladesh, a country on the coast, which is sustainable on fish produce. If we make their access to, through open ocean aquaculture en masse, think about how self-sufficient their entire ecosystem can be and how it can be beneficial. Think about state actors and not just corporate actors in this. China is 80% of aquaculture production in the status quo is from China. And China's state, they're not exactly, corporations and things going out. So we just think this is how it falls flat on its face. But actually can give the opportunities for states and places which are normally priced out by the system we have in the status quo, and which may not have access to fresh water because of the impacts of climate change, get a chance. So what is climate and the environment, and what impact does it have on this round? First, the ability to adapt, and second, the ability to improve. So first, the ability to adapt to increasing global temperatures. Climate change is happening. Temperatures caused by climate change have caused rising sea levels, more frequent and severe weather events such as hurricanes, droughts, and more. But these in turn have impacts on the ecosystem and the species that live within them. Open ocean aquaculture has the potential to be much more resilient form of food production in the face of climate change than other forms of agriculture, such as land-based farming and aquaculture. This is because open ocean is not as vulnerable to some of the effects of climate change and changes in precipitation factors and more. Why and how? Because of cooler water temperatures. Offshore aquaculture is typically located in deeper, cooler temperatures, reducing the stress on fish populations, much different compared to shallow and freshwater environments. Second, there's improved water circulation. They use advanced technologies such as underwater turbines to reduce the risk of hypoxia and other environmental stresses. And next, there's species selection. Offshore aquaculture can be better adapted to rising temperatures by selecting species better adapted to warmer waters. For example, some offshore systems are focused on producing tropical species such as cobia and barramundi. And most significantly, there is greater water availability. The offshore aquaculture systems have a greater volume of water compared to freshwater systems, which can help buffer against temperature changes and other environmental factors which we both agree are inevitable. This can help those fish populations remain healthy and productive, even in the face of a climate crisis. So, let's talk about transportation. Transportation is inevitable, but we can actually reduce transport emissions. It can reduce this by associating with the fishing industry by providing local sources of seafood. This can help reduce the carbon footprint of the fishing industry and promote sustainable transportation practices instead. Let's look at salmon farming in Norway. In recent years, Norwegian salmon farmers have shifted towards using more sustainable sources of food, such as microalgae and krill, grown locally in the ocean, creating a self-sustainable feeding emission that can reduce the carbon footprint of the seafood supply chain. And next, we can create a better world. Let's look at OTEC. Offshore aquaculture can provide several benefits to OTEC, a process that uses temperature differences to generate electricity, because it can reduce operational costs. Offshore aquaculture requires a stable platform and source of electricity, which can become resourced by OTEC. It can improve water quality, such as Barron from 2020 saying OTEC can improve water quality by pumping cold nutrient water to the surface, and this can be compatible with open ocean aquaculture, as exemplified in Martinique with numerous shrimp farms. It can also enhance monitoring and maintenance, making OTEC and offshore farms better, and using the same infrastructures used for sensoring and monitoring, and it can increase sustainability, where both contributions can be sustainable. So we become adaptable and better. Even if we cannot resolve the climate change, we still need to take action to preserve our oceans and species that inhabit them. And that is why, for all reasons, the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture is desirable.
Okay, are you good?
Yes.
Okay. Let's start at the bottom. Your arguments about like transportation, or your answers to the transportation argument, you said like you create more sustainable like food markets. I guess like what do you do to solve transportation then?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more?
Yeah, sorry. So you made an argument about like why you solve transportation, but your answer to it was just like that fish meal becomes like more sustainable.
So we think transportation is going to be inevitable. You're still going to have land-based carbon footprint when you're transporting from freshwater to other resources.
Yeah,
but when you go,
accelerate.
wait, can I continue? Sorry. But when you create offshore facilities, you create sustainable communities and ecosystems that become self-sufficient by using
okay, so you don't
like the sunlight and other things like that. We can actually reduce the effects far more than
okay, but you in other ways that don't address transportation.
Well, don't make
so the arguments about like water circulation or like how like you're more resistant to like extreme weather events, all of that. I guess like what evidence do you have that like why are aquacultures more resistant to extreme weather events? Is it just circulation of like currents?
Circulation, it's cooler temperatures, and it literally is just the very nature of being in the ocean.
Why is
so you can be deeper, and the currents can provide things like reduction of hypoxia and cooling temperatures. So any of the impacts from those big nature events, weather events, which can warm,
acidification.
Yes, that's what we have. Like, wait, explain.
Like, how does it solve can it solve ocean acidification?
By creating self-sustainable ecosystems. Acidification happens because of eutrophication and eutrophication, which when you create more open ocean aquaculture systems, you can create self-sustaining
weather
ecosystems.
Events also like can.
We're not going to resolve for all weather events that happen, but we're definitely mitigating the implications of what happens and reducing the.
I want to talk about like the malnutrition arguments, how you solve those. I guess like aquacultures exist now, right? The affirmative like is able to accelerate those. You talked about how like there are unsustainable fishing markets now in places like China, I think you mentioned.
Just in general.
Okay.
China is employing open ocean aquaculture, which is a sustainable method, which
So you think China's model is sustainable?
Well, their production of aquaculture is infinitely better than regular fishing.
So, okay. But regardless, I guess, like, what piece, or like, why, like, how do you accelerate open ocean aquacultures to be able to, like, feed, like, entire populations?
We don't think that is the burden of this debate when when the debate is literally whether it's desirable to accelerate or
Right,
undesirable.
is desire to accelerate to feed populations, how are you able to do that?
Again, I don't think we feel like we have that burden. That could literally just be having more offshore farms.
Just including more offshore farms?
Like
Offshore
acceleration of the development. It could be
Okay,
the
how do you
development.
make sure that people continue to eat fish? Like, how do you make sure people want to eat fish?
People are always going to eat fish. When the alternative of not eating fish is eating meat for your source of protein, we know the problems of the methane and what like eating meat can actually do. We think it's a much better world for people to eat
Okay,
fish.
but how do you ensure yeah, sure, you think it's better, but like, how can you ensure people eat fish over like cheap chicken or anything?
By having more of it available, so the cost of it goes down, so it's far more
Right,
accessible.
but why don't people buy cheap fish now?
Because it's not accessible, which is why we need to accelerate it.
Cheap fish is not accessible. Okay.
Existing sense of
Yeah.
fish?
That's what I'm saying. Like, why isn't existing status quo cheap fish accessible?
People still eat fish now, do they not?
But you're saying that you solve it enough to solve for like the effects of climate change. So I'm asking how you facilitate that transition.
Yes, again, so the transition from people eating regular meat and using unsustainable
Right, you
practices,
can
we
ensure
get
that
to
they
a much
do
more
that.
effective
You
system.
just make more of it, but don't ensure that they actually follow through.
Okay,
The
I
arguments you made at the top about like seaweed, do you ensure that or you said it was like your bird, like do you ensure that people always use seaweed as fish meal?
No, but we think with acceleration, we can definitely make it the primary source.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, just let me get this set up.
Is the speech structure the same in this as a policy debate? Is there like a neck block?
No. So there's like one affirmative speech, one negative speech, each have cross sections, like there are 4 constructives, 2 affirmative speeches, 2 negative speeches.
Yeah.
All the speeches are the same lengths. There's no cross sections for the last 2 rebuttals. There are only 6 speeches.
And there's only 2 rebuttals.
Yeah,
Yes.
only 2 rebuttals and 2 minutes of prep time.
Got it, thanks. Sorry.
Super
Sorry,
weird
should have
for
looked
us
this up
too.
before I showed up today.
No, you're okay.
You know.
It's, I get it.
Cool.
Anybody not ready?
I just love your shoes.
Oh, thank you.
I love your shoes too, the dogs.
All right.
Good you now. Give me a strong jump.
Okay. You should frame your ballot through the reality that the resolution means that the affirmative must defend global acceleration of aquaculture through corporate means. They don't get to specify the best version of open ocean aquaculture. They should be debating the most likely version of aquaculture because that's the only predictable way for the negative to negate them. We have presented evidence that open ocean aquaculture does not solve hunger because it only produces fish for the rich, threatens the ocean from escape disease and invasive fish, algae blooms, feeding aquaculture leading to overfishing, and aquacultures have a direct link to existential antibiotic resistance. Terrestrial aquaculture is the far better alternative. It is more pragmatic for the following reasons. 1, it is dominated by fish that do not need to be fed with protein, fish like tilapia. This means that it avoids the problem of overfishing in order to feed aquacultures in the deep water that the affirmative is talking about. 2, there's no risk of fish escapes, which means that ocean risks invasive species, which means it avoids the risk that oceans have of invasive species who have the ability to spread diseases and antibiotic resistance, all while destroying the balance of the ecosystem. 3, it's infinitely cheaper. There's no need to pay for the expenses to maintain something in the ocean. Think about simply the cost of transportation to and from an open water aquaculture in order to maintain the fish there, to to harvest them, to keep them healthy, etc. It's lower risk because open water aquacultures face the problem of being extremely high risk to invest in. They have to deal with problems like storms, pens that have pens that break, and theft, meaning that the only pragmatic thing to grow in an open water aquaculture is really expensive fish, because that's the only way to mitigate the risk of creating the aquaculture in the first place. 4 is antibiotic resistance. Fish in the ocean are pumped with antibiotics in order to keep them healthy, something that is not necessary in the terrestrial environment, given the safety of the controlled environment on land. The first affirmative argument in the second affirmative speech was one that the plan solves hunger, but terrestrial aquaculture solves just as well. They've given no reason why fish like tilapia that are herbivores, etc., don't produce the same omega-3s that are the key internal link to their argument. It is easy to feed tilapia with the same seaweed argument that they're making about how we can grow it, but seaweed is not going to feed the world and will stay in niche markets. This is the Ben Belton and 5 other PhDs in 2020. Seaweed, to contribute significantly to food and nutrition security, falls short of resource. Seaweed industry experts estimate that the global production of seaweed stands at about half of the quantity reported by the FAO. Seaweed consumption are likely to remain a minor component of future diets with only niche markets. Next, their next argument is that economies of scale solves these priced out arguments that we forwarded in the first negative speech. One, it's not a question of whether or not the different countries can produce open water aquaculture, which is what they contextualize it to with the Bangladesh example. It's a question of whether or not the consumers can purchase these high-level fish that will inevitably be fancy fin fish, things like salmon, because of the risk of creating open water aquaculture, which I did that work above. 2, they have not answered that that open water aquaculture creates the wrong fish, which I did that work, and not sustainably so. They dropped our Belton evidence that talks about how open water aquaculture results in overfishing in order to feed the carnivorous fish that is inevitably that has to be in these pens in order to make it cost effective to even create these farms in the first place. The third argument in the second affirmative speech was about their ability to solve climate change. Their first subpoint that the ocean is more resilient than land because anything in the ocean will have a better lifespan as climate change begins to rise. One that imagines that the only climate change effort being made in the status quo would be accelerating aquaculture. That's a nonsensical argument. The combination of terrestrial aquaculture with other efforts, things like the Paris Climate Accords and Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, would mean that the combination of those things outweigh this particular argument. 2, land is not perfect, but it does not. Land is not perfect, but it doesn't have to be. We solve the majority of the app without linking to any of our DAs, which is more than enough to garner a negative ballot. Next, they say that transportation is inevitable and that it would be their transportation would be net less because of the location of the open water aquaculture. This is not our argument. The Belton evidence is really specific about how open ocean aquaculture creates this problem of boats and fuels and pollution. We have two ships literally passing in the night on this argument. They've not made a direct response. Next, they make their electricity argument. This argument is outweighed by the cost open water aquaculture has to the environment in the long term. This means that they wouldn't be able to produce a long-term electricity, meaning that this doesn't matter. At the end of the day, they have dropped our overfishing arguments, our antibiotic resistance arguments, which we've read specific evidence about how antibiotic resistance can jump from fish to people, making it an existential threat. Terrestrial fishing is better and mutually exclusive with the affirmative because there's not enough money to do both. I'm gonna stay right here for cross-sects because I definitely remember that was happening.
You're good.
Whenever you are ready.
It took me a while to adjust to this.
Your format.
I only do this one.
Oh, really? Kind of us. All right.
Okay. When I'm ready.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110, 111,
You mentioned that the global acceleration means that it has to be through corporate means. Who's the biggest producer in aquaculture?
So currently, the United States is ranked 17th among
So who's the biggest? Who's number one?
So I'm gonna get there in a second. So while I do not know the specific answer to who is number one, I do know that because we're ranked 17th and have so much coast and a very large EEZ, the U.S. would be the natural place for open water aquaculture to begin expanding, which would mean that our poor regulations and inability to manage that would be modeled by other countries.
Well, the number one producer of aquaculture is China. And
Sure.
China is not using corporations, so we don't understand why the global acceleration would mean that it has to be through corporate means.
The space where there is like physical space to accelerate is in places like the U.S. that are rather fond of capitalism.
Okay. And you talked about antibiotic resistance. Why will antibiotic resistance not happen in freshwater?
Oh, do you mean
Like freshwater
terrestrial?
fish.
Oh,
you
in-
talked about antibiotic resistance happening in the fish in the ocean.
Yes.
Why would that not happen in freshwater, depending? Or like land-based? Sorry.
Oh, land-based. Okay, now I'm with you.
Saying that.
So because terrestrial aquacultures are more controlled environments, there's not a need to medicate fish to
Okay,
protect
but
them
they're
against
closer
diseases.
density, so actually things like disease and outbreak are much more likely to happen, as opposed to an open ocean aquaculture where they literally just have more space.
So we fundamentally disagree because the fish that are entered into terrestrial aquacultures are healthy to begin with,
Okay, okay. You
which
said,
is not a guarantee.
yeah,
of
so
You
success.
you're
can also
land
kill
based.
them off and it won't spread.
Yeah,
So-
it's easier to kill them off.
Okay, so you talked about land-based being dominated by things that don't need to be carnivorous.
Yes.
Carnivorous. Do you want to eat tilapia and that kind of stuff?
I think tilapia is great.
Do you think the world is going to want to eat those
I
kind of things?
think you
Let's
are
be
making an
realistic.
ivory tower argument about how only rich people want to eat fish and that tilapia is bad. Personally, as someone who grew up in a working class family, we ate
I
tilapia
get that,
all the
but I
time.
think you need to be realistic about malnutrition and hunger and starvation and the things that people want to
Tilapia has the same omega-3s that you read as the internal
Okay.
link to your arguments.
Okay.
Also, you have
I'm
not
linking it
spec
to,
the
like,
type of
social-
fish you're growing. We simply gave an example.
eat. Okay, so
Also-
we talk about, sorry, I just got a lot to say. We talk about the cost of transportation. In land-based, in the status quo, is transportation harms not even exacerbated because they're globally exported and imported?
That's your plan. You accelerate open water aquaculture.
No, okay, so places that don't have land-based, places that don't have access to
Sure.
freshwater.
Can you rephrase your question? I simply
It's
don't
okay,
understand
we'll
it.
move on, we have things to say.
Land-based aquaculture is in little pens on like in
Literal
places,
land.
like-
You don't have to
like-
drive a boat out to the middle of the open ocean or the middle of
No,
your
I
EEZ.
understand, but land-based aquaculture also is freshwater aquaculture. They're all synonymous for this, like a similar concept. But you talked about economies of scale.
Yeah.
Are consumers having access to everything now?
So our argument is that economies of scale do not solve your arguments about
But why is
producing.
it going to be sold in freshwater?
Are you interested in the answer to your question? So the argument is that you posited in the second affirmative speech that economies of scale would solve that the fish that are produced in the open ocean are expensive in the status quo. If we produce a lot more of them, the supply is much higher, so the cost goes down. Cool. So given that you made that argument, our argument is not. We don't think that your argument is responsive to the indictment that we're making. It's not a question of whether or not countries have the ability to start producing aquaculture. It's a question of whether or not the consumers can buy that fish once they get there.
Thank you.
There are examples about Bangladesh.
And then the last question I have is, OTEC exists, which can reduce the impacts of climate change and more. If offshore aquaculture helps this, why is this undesirable?
Because we think offshore aquaculture is unsustainable, which would mean that it doesn't matter if it can produce electricity in the short term. We're interested in long-term solutions.
I'd like to start this rebuttal by reiterating our framework. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, desirable refers to qualities or characteristics that are considered valuable, attractive, or beneficial in a particular context or situation. We do not need to prove that open ocean aquaculture is perfect. I can't emphasize enough that we should not be making the perfect the enemy of the good. The certain situation in this context is feeding people. One more person fed is a win for the affirmative. The negative harms list have been ranged from emissions released from boat transportation to people apparently not eating fish, so we don't have enough proof that people are going to eat fish in the future. Correct. We don't solve for all pollution. We move toward a more sustainable environment with certainly less of it. And correct, we're not going to force feed fish in people's mouths in the future. Right, but when they see the benefits that it reaps and the low cost, when it's adopted more with the acceleration, they're going to eat it. They're going to do the advantages that I will list. There is simply more ocean, more availability than there are land-based or freshwater sources that they are defending. The land-based agriculture argument hasn't really been extended much, but I'll answer regardless. When this can work in compatibility with OTEC in the ocean, creating entirely sustainable ecosystems for countries to utilize, this is something that we absolutely must accelerate. We are told that there is a cost in consumer access, but this can still be resolved in more access. If there are more salmon out there, more and more grocery stores, more in local communities, then consumers gain access to cheaper production. Now moving on to our main contentions. Number 1, food. Starvation and malnutrition are amongst the most devastating issues the world is facing today. Millions are starving and millions more. 768 million people worldwide, according to the UN to be exact, suffer from malnutrition-related health problems that Iman mentioned in her speech, such as growth, weakened immune systems, and cognitive impairment. How is this okay? How can we ignore this? We need action now. The negative does not answer this, does not answer how we need this action immediately. Through the existing overfishing and exploitation that I discussed in my first speech, and our unprecedented growing population expected to be 9.7 billion by 2050, and there's still being an estimation of 30 million metric tons of seafood needed to keep up, the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture is not just a net good, it is a means to survive. Citing back to the Bluford report, research found that about 166 million micronutrient deficiencies could be averted by 2030 if the global production of marine and freshwater foods is increased by 15.5 million tons, 8%. Open ocean aquaculture has unmanned scalability, again referencing how just big the ocean is, referencing Gentry's calculation of our current seafood supply being from only 0.015% of the ocean's area surface. We need to harness this potential. As Iman explained, open ocean aquaculture produces better food due to the natural diet and environment of the fish, resulting in healthier and more robust fish with higher levels of protein, including omega-3 fatty acids. This is why people are going to eat fish. As climate change is only worsening our food resources with rising temperatures and extreme weather destroying crops, land-based agriculture, acceleration of open ocean aquaculture is only more imperative. The acceleration of open ocean aquaculture addresses both the immediate and long-term challenges of hunger and malnutrition while promoting environmental sustainability. The harms they have that outweigh the benefits to this are that there might be some antibiotic resistance in some of these fish. Then let's accelerate to get more development to create the technology to prevent this stuff from happening. And moving to our second contention, this sustainability unique to open ocean aquaculture allows me to fall into me and Iman's second contention of the climate and environment, with the first point being sustainability of offshore placement. Offshore aquaculture offers unique sustainability advantages that cannot be ignored. Reiterating our case points, firstly, a study by the Food and Agriculture Organization has shown that it prevents eutrophication by improving water quality and minimizing the spread of disease to wild fish populations. Secondly, numerous studies have demonstrated its ability to enhance marine protected areas, reduce fishing pressures on wild fish stocks, and support local economy. And finally, shared infrastructure and resources between offshore aquaculture and ocean thermal energy conversion facilities have been exemplified in Kona Blue Farms in Hawaii and Martinique that Iman explained, reducing operational costs and promoting local food production. The marine fishery is an industrialized blue carbon pool essentially that serves as a removable carbon sink by promoting CO2 absorption in water bodies through fishery activities and removing carbon upon harvesting mariculture organisms. 2, our second point under our environmental convention is adaptability. It can help to mitigate climate change by promoting carbon sequestration through the growth of marine organisms such as seaweed and shellfish, which absorb and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I don't really understand the argument that we're like growing more finfish and all these more expensive things when most of our growths are like seaweed and shellfish that are promoting carbon sequestration, that are mitigating climate change. Additionally, by promoting the growth of blue carbon ecosystems such as seagrass meadows and mangrove forests, open ocean aquaculture can enhance carbon storage. In terms of food production, open ocean aquaculture can potentially be more resilient in the face of climate change than land-based farming because it is less vulnerable to changes in precipitation patterns and soil quality. Cooler water temperatures, improved water circulation, and species selection are some of the ways in which open ocean aquaculture can adapt to rising temperatures caused by climate change. Open ocean aquaculture can reduce transportation emissions associated with the fishing industry by providing local sources of seafood. This can help to reduce the carbon footprint of the fishing industry and promote sustainable transportation practices. Climate change is happening. Less people are getting access to food and produce. There's going to be a future where Idaho can't grow potatoes, where land is not a platform or a place where we can live, let alone produce food. Think about the floods happening in Pakistan, where their agriculture is destroyed. Think about the droughts that are happening in the Middle East. Our land is not a viable platform anymore and not sustainable in our dire future. We need to look to the ocean to be sustainable, to save our ecosystems. We need the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture for our ocean that is dying, for our people that are starving. If this isn't a cry for help, I don't know what is. Amon and I are proud to affirm. Thank you.
It's just gonna be straight on. Okay. Oh wow, I almost said that. Not the right time. Is anyone not good?
You should frame your ballot through the reality that the resolution means that the affirmative must defend global expansion of ocean aquaculture through corporate means. The natural place for open water aquaculture is the United States because we have a large EEZ and are not currently a large producer of aquaculture, which means that acceleration will happen in the United States, which they have conceded throughout this entire debate. This means that the global model for acceleration will be dominated by profit-focused capitalist companies. This means that you should prioritize the advocacy that solves the most negative externalities of an inevitable problem with an inevitable solution. Terrestrial aquaculture is the best option because it solves hunger by producing cheaper and more accessible fish with a lower risk and solves climate change because it allows for the same transition away from meat that the plan solves for. There are 4 things the plan does not solve for. First is finfish. It is the only economically viable to grow finfish fish in the open ocean because of the risk of creating these plants. These open ocean farms risk losses from theft, storms, fish escapes, etc. To counteract this risk, companies have to produce fish they know will turn a massive profit, which means that the people who need fish most won't ever be able to afford it, which is why they cannot solve any of their offense about hunger. Second is antibiotic resistance. It's an existential threat. Diseases can go from animals to humans. COVID is an example of this and proves that it will kill at least 23,000 people as per our evidence. And if it is about prioritizing the needs of the negative, or whether or not the negative is desirable, this risk alone is enough to vote negative. Third is algae blooms and invasive species. The plan allows for the creation of too many nutrients and escaped non-native fish in the environment, which leads to the destruction of the environment, meaning they can't solve any of their ocean, climate, or electricity claims. Algae blooms is a reason why their ecosystems would never work, which means they're net less sustainable than the status quo, which is a reason to vote negative for land-based agriculture because we are able to solve that using pens on land. Fourth is overfishing, which was conceded. And finfish are carnivorous, which means feeding smaller fish to feed the larger fish, or the fish that are more expensive, which A, means that they cannot meet their costs, but B, they are overall less sustainable. As per all of their arguments about prioritizing environmental and ecosystem needs, their arguments about what desirability means, yes, it's a question of whether or not the affirmative is beneficial, and if we win, that there are reasons you should not vote affirmative because the affirmative causes net worse harms in this debate. It means that you should vote negative, as we have proven that there are net externalities that they have not answered that they have not answered. They have dropped that the counter advocacy does not have to be necessary, but only has to be sufficient in order to solve all of our harms and solve all of theirs, which we have sufficiently done. The next argument they made was about that there's more people in the ocean, which means that we must accelerate it and that it'll cause low cost. We've just proven all of that above by saying that producers are inherently capitalist and want to make the most profit, which means charging more even if economies of scale are true. Their arguments and prospects about tilapia don't make any sense when people will farm salmon, which is a finfish that will cost more money because people want to make more money out of it, which means that only rich people will be able to receive the salmon, the fish that they are producing in the first place, which means that they cannot solve any of their impacts about hunger or malnutrition. Their arguments about overfishing being unprecedented, it's wrong, and not in the it's because overfishing is happening now. The only way to solve this is by creating land-based agriculture, where aquacultures, where we are able to solve overfishing, because they said in Cross-Ex that China is already creating aquacultures now, which proves that it would be unsustainable to accelerate globally because they have said that they do that in the first place. Their arguments about better food and diets, including omega-3s. There's no reason that the counter plan cannot solve this because it also produces the the fish that we produce also have the same nutrients, which means we are able to solve hunger. Their arguments about climate change is ruining our food ruining land-based aquacultures is false because we made arguments in the 2NC and in Cross-Ex about how there are already ways to solve climate change now, and how things like the Paris Climate Accord and the Inflation Reduction Act are already trying to mitigate the effects of climate change. It's also nonsensical, the idea that we wouldn't be able to solve problems with our transportation because the fish don't have to be transported from land from anywhere. They're bred literally within the pens, so none of this matters. Their arguments about that we can accelerate technology to solve antibiotic resistance isn't a reason to vote affirmative because that's inevitable in the status quo as per their evidence, because they say aquacultures are inevitable now, but it's try or die to make it sustainable. So this cannot be true because they disrupt the status quo, which means that we would be able to solve it now, but can't solve it after because they allow fish to escape and create which creates antibiotic resistant fish. Their arguments about MPAs reducing the pressure of climate change to support local economies are not true because they're assuming arguments that the ocean be in a carbon sink, which means that the ocean would be a carbon sink now, but they make it net less sustainable because they allow for algae blooms and things like that, which produce and also allow for carbon emissions in the first place. Allow for carbon emissions. Their arguments about growing more fish to allow for seaweed. We read evidence about how seaweed cannot sustain the world. So even if it or sustain the world or fish, because fish won't eat it, and neither will humans, because no one wants to eat no one wants to eat seaweed in the first place. So this means you must vote negative because we have provided you with 4 reasons that they have not accounted for, and that the counterplan is sufficient to solve all of their harms and all of ours, and they are mutually exclusive because they create net worse harms. Good debate.
I voted negative, mostly because of the analysis they were giving. I think that you all are right. I don't think, though, that you're making the reasons that you're right, and they're right. They proposed a counter plan, and they are telling me that there are 4 problems that the affirmative is going to cause that their counter plan will not cause. I think that there's a lot of reasons that the counter plan wouldn't work, and probably also leads to some of the same issues. For example, I don't think that you can scale land-based in nearly the same way that you can scale ocean. I think that, you know, maybe as much as having boats go out on the ocean sucks, probably having trucks driving to the land bases is also just as bad. Also, both of these things require massive amounts of shipments that a little bit of boat doesn't really matter. They also, you know, there's several things like that, right, that I think are reasons that their counter plan wouldn't really work. But the issue is that you all aren't really telling me that. I think if the affirmative, these last couple speeches had started by saying, look, their plan doesn't get you carbon sequestration. Their plan doesn't do anything about electricity. And those are unique. Like, maybe they reduce some malnutrition, but that's only one part of our plan. There's all of this other stuff going on that they're not able to solve for, and that matters a lot more than maybe a couple little fishes swim out into the sea. That matters a lot more than 20, let's say that, sure, antibiotic resistance happens, and 23,000 people died. That's a drop in the bucket compared to what you all are solving for. You know, I don't know what an algae bloom is. No one ever explains it. I'm a historian. I'm not a scientist, but I'm going to guess algae blooms are bad. But I'm going to guess that there's reasons that you all wouldn't actually. Do you get what I'm saying, though? Like, there's just, I think you all are fundamentally right, but they're being ticky-tacky policy debaters and spinning this in a way, and you have to be giving me the analysis. And it seems like that you all have done a really good job preparing for these debates by writing a lot of things out beforehand. But you have to get into the weeds of what they're saying and really tell me directly, right? Like, I know that they said this. So for example, in your last speech, you said they don't really extend the thing about land, and that was most of their speech, right? So there's just kind of like a mismatch of what I'm hearing going on in the debate and then what you're telling me is going on. And you're telling me, for the most part of your last speech, that malnutrition is bad and we need to solve it. And they're agreeing with that and saying, but we're also solving this and avoiding some of these other problems. And you're not really engaging with what those other problems are and giving me a compelling reason why that you wouldn't lead to those problems. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think, like I said, I think in terms of like reality, I think that there's lots of reasons that their counter proposal wouldn't work, but there's just not enough like direct comparison of those two worlds, right? Like, it's about storytelling and stuff like that too. Do you have any questions before I have just a